Thank you so much for joining me
Thank you.
to talk with me. I wanted to ask you many things actually. One
Okay.
is about your how you got into music, your upbringing,
Mhm.
and how much of that music is present now in your current compositions and what you do now.
Sure. So I grew up being trained in Carnatic music, which is considered the classical music of South India. And I grew up playing the mrudangam, but I also was exposed to a lot of other kinds of music from India, especially film music, and other like devotional musics and popular musics. So all of those for me are connected. So even though I was really, sort of intensively trained in one form, I think for me that there's a whole sound world that permeates through the classical, through folk, or whatever these delineations we have. Because I grew up with all of that as kind of one cultural bundle. And I also grew up listening to a lot of American music. And when I started college, I got into jazz, and I started working more with jazz trained musicians. Um, and I'd say that now, I mean, over the past year, I've been writing, or year or two, I've been writing for musicians who are classically trained in the Western tradition. And it's been really interesting to see what comes through in that process, because it's one thing to channel these different influences as an improviser, because it's somewhat like in the moment, and your body kind of surprises you in terms of like what happens and how you respond. And in composing, it's been different. It's been more of a choice, I'd say, to sort of sit and think about how these sounds figure into something new. Um, and it's hard to describe. I mean, obviously, I'm playing the mridangam in this particular piece that we're playing together, but I also obviously write for other instruments, and I have to think about how the idea of raga, which is so foundational to a lot of different South Asian musical forms, how does that get translated into instruments that are maybe thinking more of pitch in a discrete way, rather than a continuous or melismatic uh, kind of style. Um, and the other thing is the rhythmic approach, which is also quite different. Um, and there isn't like a, sort of cheat sheet for how to understand how these influences continue to sort of live within me. Um, and they also, I'm never really trying to reproduce something authentic. I
Mm-hmm.
I really like going back and allowing new things that I discover to permeate, even if I go back to like a Carnatic classical context. How does that change my playing in that context, or what kind of new rhythmic perspectives come into how I understand something that I've known for a long time? So it's been a back and forth and circular process, I'd say. And I think in this piece that I wrote for the two of us, um, I was thinking a lot about the voice, and it's something that I've been trying to play with a little bit more. And I was never really officially trained in Carnatic music, but I obviously grew up listening to it, and I grew up with a lot of different forms from that region of the world, and I kind of consider myself self-taught in that way. And so I really wanted to see how it would sound in this context, which is interestingly resonant with how it works in Carnatic music, because you usually have a vocalist and a violinist and a mridangam player. And essentially, in this piece, I've reproduced that texture, but it sounds very different. And I was kind of intrigued by that. What are the other intersections of these instruments, especially when I'm doing two at the same time, which is also relatively new for me.
So I have a couple questions.
Hmm.
Um, this combination the instrumentation
Hmm.
um, is a typical one. right? But you say that this piece comes across differently. Is it because I'm not trained in Carnatic music? Is that part of that? Is it how you wrote it? You mentioned delineation, right? And so you do a lot of improvising in a jazz group. Your group is Rajas, is that right?
Rajas, yeah.
Yeah, um, and I love the sounds that your group produces, and oh, it's just beautiful.
Thank you.
And so I was wondering, how do you make that shift from, or do you have to make that shift from the jazz or Carnatic music, and what does that mean writing for a classical musician like me? Or do you classify this as classical music? I mean, I'm so confused as what is actually classical music nowadays. How would you define that?
I feel like I would ask you the same question. I don't usually try to label anything one way or the other. I think even if I'm doing something that to other people might fit in a particular label, I don't really like thinking of it in those bounded terms. So I'd say that what you are playing in this piece is nowhere really near anything that the violin would do in a South Indian classical concert. There's a kind of hierarchy that's been formed in the modern concert format in South India, which is, the vocalist is sort of the main person who brings in the repertoire, and then the violinist is considered an accompanist and usually shadows the voice, and then when an improvisational space happens, they take turns. And so it's very, you don't have a lot of counterpoint except with the mrudangam. So when the mrudangam comes in, there's a lot of rhythmic shaping that happens. And that's where the majority of the counterpoint exists in that music. And it's interesting how this piece developed because the mrudangam, playing mrudangam and singing at the same time, one usually tends to kind of be centered. You kind of need to focus your attention somewhere is how I figured it out. And there isn't a lot of precedent for doing the two at the same time. So I've been just kind of figuring something out that works, and each piece that I write for myself in this vein expands what is possible. So even when I was writing this piece, there were some things I wasn't sure I was going to be able to play. It was sort of aspirational, and when we got together, that's the majority of how I figured it out. I was like, okay, I can focus my energy here, and then I need to think more about what the mrudangam is doing here, and let the voice kind of follow along. But they're really united by being performed by the same body. So I've been trying to just sit with that and sit with what it means to be in my body and play these instruments that are familiar and that have absorbed a lot from that tradition, but are going in completely different spaces. And the way that I wrote your part, I think, was very much as kind of thinking of harmonic and melodic counterpoint with the voice, and the mrudangam as a kind of chaotic factor. Rather than something that was expected to form, like sort of follow a particular metric form or something like that. So I was thinking of it more texturally and as commentary.
It was interesting because you stretched me in the sense that you said, I want you to improvise on these harmonies, and it's not something I'm used to doing or comfortable doing. Mm-hmm. And I appreciated your patience in allowing me to experiment and try all of that. But when you said, when you just explained that usually the violin improvises on the voice, you actually did the opposite. And it's really amazing to watch you play the mrudangam and also sing at the same time. It was
it's very new for me. But I also should say that when you told me that you had never really improvised before, I was shocked when you played, because it sounded like you've been doing this for a really long time. And Like first section where you're improvising, I just wanted it to be whimsical, and I was thinking, okay, well, it'll just be a chance to kind of warm up and get to know each other, because the mrudangam part and the voice to some extent are driven by improvisation. So even though I've notated my vocal part, I've left myself a lot of room to take the breath and shape the contour of the ornaments the way that it feels natural in that moment. And so I wanted to give you a space also to have that freedom. And I actually thought, I mean, as you know, we spoke about it, and I was like, oh, this needs to be a much longer space because you're doing amazing things, and I want to hear all of that. So I didn't feel like you were new to it in any way. I learned a lot actually from how you approached it.
Oh, thank you. Because I was really nervous,
Yeah.
I have to say. I was really nervous. But tell me a little bit about the title of.
But I couldn't tell.
Tell me a little bit about the title of this duo,
Sure.
Illuminance.
Yeah, it's called Illuminance, Scattered Truths. And it actually really, a lot of it came out of uh, actually one conversation that we had where we were just talking. I think it was in November or maybe early December, where we were just sitting with this massive political shift, and also this sort of political stubbornness that was going on in the country. And over the course of the pandemic, seeing how it wasn't just the pandemic that was going on, but also an intensification of the movement for Black lives and all this violence that was going on, and with the counterpoint from the protesters and this counterpoint from these institutions who were suddenly put on the spot to say something or do something or somehow prove allegiance to the larger zeitgeist, I guess. And that day that we were speaking about this, and just the frustration of just generally organizations and individuals um, wanting to say the right thing but not necessarily do the right thing, and how that kind of creates this alternative reality where it's all about appearances. And illuminance as a word kind of refers to not the literal light of something, but light as it's reflected off of something else. And I thought about truth also being scattered in that way, scattered as light can be scattered, um, and turning into these narratives that take on a life of their own and slowly move away from what's really happening, or real change or real transformation. And so I was thinking a lot about that as I was writing this piece. And I guess in a way, the piece also reflects that theme in some ways. I think it was, for me, even as an artist, just thinking about the ways that I'm honest to myself, or the ways I've been called in by, dear friends, to be more honest about where I'm situated as an artist, which included starting to use my voice and starting to experiment with thinking of myself more expansively. So in a very personal way, I think it reflects that the stories we tell about ourselves, or the things we pretend to be, whereas we could find something more beautiful and more resonant when we really tap into what gives us joy and what feels like the truth. So in that way, I think it was reflected in the piece for me. I still have to think about it, I think, because I think we had this conversation where you were asking me what I thought the piece was about, and it always comes in at the very end. For me, or even sometimes after the piece is performed, is really when it hits me. So
In a way, our perspective after learning the piece and performing it and recording it, the perspective changes as well, as
Yes,
like you're
yes.
talking about, reflecting and different light, and what does it really mean now, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to its initial intention.
Yeah.
Um, and somebody told me that a piece is not really uh, finished until at least after the first premiere or first performances, because there's so
Yeah.
much to learn through that
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. And I might even argue it's not complete until the second performance, which is when
Right.
you've gotten over the nerves. And
Well, I would love to have another chance to perform this with you.
yeah, and I hope that we can do it with a live audience sometime soon.
Yeah, yeah, that would be
Yeah.
great. You started in 2018 a collective called We Have Voice Collective, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, with the We Have Voice Collective, yeah, usually we don't, everything is done in a very collective way, in the sense that even when we're talking about the group and we're talking about the work we do, um, the way that we field interviews or field any kind of engagement with the press has always been largely in a collective way. But I can speak to the importance of that issue for me, which is the issue of sexual harassment and of course other kinds of abuse of power that go on, obviously not only in musical institutions but just institutions across the board. Um, it was really a beautiful experience to have this gathering of 14 female and non-binary musicians coming together, and we did a lot of this uh, collaboration over email and just sending each other drafts of what a code of conduct could look like. Um, and I learned a lot in the process. I think it was helpful for me also to just see that this kind of a document was possible. Of course, it started with an open letter, and it started with organizations and individuals signing on to that open letter and just stating that, okay, we agree that this kind of change needs to happen, and then it sort of sublimated, I guess, into this document that has been adopted by venues and by musicians and their tech writers. Is just sort of as a symbol to say these are the ethical principles that we would like to stand for
Mm.
and amplify. I mean, but the same kind of danger exists there of needing to say that you're doing something as opposed to actually doing it. And I do think it worked. I do think it started a conversation, and I think that it was what was actually quite helpful was that we in different groupings we would go and we'd have kind of town hall style roundtable discussions with communities at various universities or colleges, and that was the real work for me, I think, was to see that and was to actually, okay, there's this document here, and that can be used in different ways to hold an institution accountable, but what are the actual conversations we're having with people? And I do think it made a difference, that document, having it. Of course, it's a complicated issue, of course, and there's no sort of one size fits all solution. And that's actually part of what went into the work behind this document, was that it's not about us coming in as a collective to tell you how to solve these problems. It's about pointing to a common document that can be a starting point for a conversation. And the solution is going to look different, and it's going to depend on what the situation is at different institutions, and if there have been any kind of breaches of this sort of idea of consent or power, then how are you in your very specific situation going to handle it? Not in the sense of like, oh, well, we're going to then come in and police the situation or something like that, because that's incredibly complex, and we also don't, you know, pretend to have that sort of expertise. I don't think anybody can have that kind of universal expertise. It's really,
Right.
it's situation dependent, and it's so rooted in people speaking up. So that part doesn't change. That part is still necessary, and I think it was important in that moment, right after the Me Too movement, for this document to be circulated. And I don't think it's, you know, lost momentum, particularly in the last couple of years. I think people still, you know, I've certainly been asked about it a lot, about We Have Voice, and though we're not quite as active as we were in 2018, I think it made a difference to have such a document exist, even as a starting point.
Even hearing you talk about the process, there's so many organizations now that are creating these equity, diversity, inclusion groups, and the members of these organizations will come up to, I'm in one actually in the Boston Symphony, and they'll come up and say, well, what do we do? What do we do? And you phrased it actually perfectly. It's not really what, it's not a guideline for what to do. It's a guideline, right? But it's not a document to say this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
It's actually, in a way, helpful to be able to reflect on one's own actions, right?
Yeah.
And it really comes down to humanities, and really what's the decent thing to do. And I guess maybe the danger of having rules set out is that if the rule's not there, that means it's okay to do, which it isn't, right? And you can't accommodate for every single situation.
Yeah, you don't want to have a space where it's not spoken about, and it's also, as you were saying, like it's really, it comes down to listening. It does come down to listening and making sure those who are the most vulnerable in a situation get heard and get, you know, have a space to speak up, and that they're not silenced. So this is the mrudangam. It's a South Indian percussion instrument, and I'm just going to speak a little bit about how it's constructed and how to tune it. So the first thing people often ask about is, what am I doing on this side? Because I've got a little cup of water here, and I keep tuning it by adding water to it throughout the time I'm playing. And this paste is actually used to bring the drum head to this low sound, the bass sound. Without that, it just sounds like a plain drum head. So the reason why we have this paste, is so that I can create those kind of grace notes. And this paste itself is made out of cream of wheat, out of semolina and water mixed together to make this paste. So every time I perform or play, I add this paste, and I can use it to adjust the weight and tuning. And then after I'm done playing, I take it off and start again the next time I'm playing. And the other interesting thing about this instrument is that this black patch is made out of an iron manganese ore powder that's mixed with rice, cooked rice. And in India, the artisans that make this instrument will turn that into a paste. It's a black paste, and they'll add it in layers in concentric circles, slowly building this little arc and black patch here. And this side also has two different skins, so there's a little pocket here, and in between those two skins are these bamboo sticks for resonating, and that lower skin is goat hide, and the rest of it is cow leather. So that's what creates that frequency. And usually the two sides are connected by leather straps, but the instrument that I have has nylon straps, which are a little bit better to adjust to different climates. And the way that you tune this instrument, so you can tune it to different pitches. Each drum has a given range. So if I wanted to lower it, I just hit it this way,
and it loosens the tightness here, and if I want to tighten it and increase the pitch, I hit it this way, which overall stretches the membrane and increases the pitch. So because there are 16 points here all in the circle, I have to tune it and make sure each of the sides is in tune with one another. And this particular instrument is tuned to D, and it has an open tone that's somewhere, it's a hard to define space, but some kind of somewhere in between a minor second and a major second from the tonic. And then of course the left side, which sounds like this.